I never planned to share a roof with the one man who could undo me with a raised eyebrow. He was my rival in studio, my measuring stick, the spark under every late-night sketch. When housing slapped our names on the same door, I packed extra patience and a spare smile. What I didn't pack was the courage to admit I liked the way he said my name. We planned floor plans. We didn't plan a kiss. Not that night. If this resonated, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps this channel keep telling thoughtful, heartwarming stories every week. The first time I saw the label stuck crooked on the mailbox, I thought it was a prank. 2 names in block letters, one slightly smudged, the other written like a draftsman's ideal. My name Julian pressed in with a dull pen. His name Mason, clean and sharp. I stood in the hallway of that old brownstone, the hum of the city passing through the windows like a whispered suggestion, and I laughed quietly, the way you do when life's sense of humor lands right on your doorstep. I'd spent 3 years circling Mason like planets share an orbit, close enough to feel the pull, never close enough to collide. In studio, he was the one whose models made jurors lean forward, whose line weights looked like they'd learned to breathe. I was the one who raised a hand when critiques went soft, who would argue a concept until midnight and then show up at 6 a.m. with a stronger version. We were both stubborn, both serious, both convinced we had something to prove. It felt fair in an annoying way. I took a breath, found the key with the bright red tape on it, and climbed the last set of stairs. The apartment was exactly what you'd expect from grad student housing in a city that quotes you $3,000 for a closet. 2 bedrooms. A living room that had seen better paint, a kitchen with a window above the sink that made up for the fluorescent lighting, and floors that creaked their own opinions. Sunlight slanted in and caught dust that hadn't decided where to land yet. He was already there. He stood in the living room in a faded gray t-shirt and jeans, hair damp from a shower that must have tested those old pipes, a box cutter in one hand and a stack of flattened cardboard at his feet. When he turned, he smiled, and I felt all the mortars of my good humor shift. "Julian," he said, easy as if we'd been expecting this. "They told me the twist, but I didn't believe it until I saw your name downstairs. We're either the punchline or the setup," I said, because I didn't know yet which one it would be. He held out his hand, and it was clean of adhesive but not of calluses. I took it. It was a firm shake, the kind that says we can do this. Past him, I saw the corner where he'd already parked a drafting table, the good kind with a tilting surface and a lamp clamped on, everything squared to the wall. He had placed a plant by the window, a plant already alive, which felt like optimism or arrogance depending on how you looked at it. "I took the front bedroom," he said, nodding toward a door. "More noise, less heat. But the window faces the sycamore, and I figured you like quiet for sleeping." "You figured," I repeated, because the idea that he had any sense of what I liked was unfamiliar. He shrugged, the motion small and unbothered. "I've watched you look for the corners nobody else sees. You look, then you listen. It's useful." I set my bag down and felt the hallway dust settle on my shoes like a welcome. "Useful," I said, and tried not to show my surprise at being known. We unpacked in a choreography that wasn't yet graceful, but wasn't awkward either. He favored the left-hand shelves. I took the right. His glassware clinked with the sound of thrift stores and good choices. Mine thudded with the sound of donations from relatives who want you to eat more. He lined his pencils by hardness in a chipped mug with an old baseball team's logo. I poured my odds and ends into a wooden tray and pretended that chaos is a style. It wasn't until he pulled a small pot from a box and set it on the stove that I realized he intended to cook. Not heat water for ramen, not split a pizza menu with me, but cook. He rinsed rice until the water ran clear, stirred onions and garlic in butter, and talked about nothing loaded. How the landlord liked to be called before noon. How the laundry machines accepted quarters like they were on a diet. How the deli on the corner made a turkey sandwich so generous it needed a napkin just to survive. "You cook," I said, as if he hadn't demonstrated it in front of me. The onions softened and admitted they were mortal. "It calms me," he said. "Studio can run hot. Cooking runs steady. And my mom used to say the kitchen is where people tell the truth." I filed that away with whatever else I was learning. We ate at the table near the window, the only table, The one we would later cover with trace and chipboard and coffee rings we would pretend not to notice. He spooned risotto into bowls, the rice a little firm, the broth rich. It tasted like the kind of patience I didn't think he had. We didn't toast, but if we had, we would have raised our forks to detente. I know this is odd, he said after a while when the sun had moved beyond the sycamore and the apartment had taken on that late afternoon glow that forgives a lot. Landing in the same place. After all the crits and the pinups and the stuff. You mean the way you never let anyone finish a sentence without asking them to define their terms? I asked. Because humor is a tool and honesty is a slow one. He laughed and shook his head. I mean the way we sharpen each other and pretend we're not grateful for it. That's generous, I said, and meant it. I was going to say annoying first. I can be both, he said. We probably both can. The first week settled in like a guest who hopes to stay. We learned the rhythms of each other's mornings. He was an early riser, a quiet one, who put the kettle on before dawn and read with his foot tapping. I was an early riser too, but I moved in bursts. Shower, coffee, keys in a row. His coffee was strong and black. Mine required milk and a whisper of sugar. He had a way of leaning on the counter and listening to the radio news, like he wanted to understand the world before he designed any of it. I had a way of opening the window just enough, even in October, because fresh air felt like possibility. In studio, nothing changed, and everything changed. He was still the one with the precise models, the clean presentations, the narrative that made professors nod. I was still the one who worked through ideas out loud, who pinned up sketches that implied motion, who stood too close to the paper as if willing it to bloom. But now, in between, there was the walk home where we paused at the light, and he said, "Did you see how Professor Chen lit up when you pivoted to the community courtyard? That's your sweet spot right there." There was the way I said, "Your section is singing, but your roofline wants to talk. Try lowering the clear story on the west." It felt like truce, like something gentler than rivalry, but more charged than friendship. Every so often, the old script reasserted itself. After one pinup, where my building's circulation was compared to a maze and not in a good way, while his received a string of adjectives so laudatory they felt like a museum plaque, I came home with a jaw so tight it might have cracked. He walked in after me with his backpack slung low and a quiet humility that might have been real or might have been good manners. Either way, when he said, "Want to talk about it?" I heard an invitation and a dare. "What's to talk about?" I asked, opening and closing drawers because I needed something to complete. "Only what you want to," he said, and opened the fridge. He handed me a cold bottle of ginger ale like a peace offering. "But if I were you, and I'm not, and I know that, I'd want someone to say your critique was fair and also wrong. Fair because your circulation is a mess, and wrong because nobody talked about your light. That light you found in your stairwell? That holds a whole story." He leaned on the counter, and the words landed one by one like well-planned steps. I wanted to be angry and grateful in equal measure, so I did the thing my father taught me when a problem sat in my palm. I named it. "I'm jealous," I said, tasting the word and finding it salty, "of how they talk about your work like it already exists, of how you can stand so still in front of them, of how you put your coffee cup down the same way every day like even that's under control." He blinked and then smiled, not triumphant, not smug. "Okay," he said. "Thank you for telling me. Now I'll tell you something. I envy the way you let people see you thinking. I learned how to hide that a long time ago. I envy how your sketches ask questions without apologizing for needing answers. I envy that you could have cut corners on that stairwell detail and you didn't. Sometimes the most disarming thing in the world is someone telling you you're strong where you thought you were struggling." I took a breath and let my shoulders loosen. We drank our ginger ales in silence for a while. The old fridge hummed. Somewhere outside, a bus sighed. The plant by the window leaned into the last light. That night, because our bodies had learned the same discipline from different teachers, we both went back to studio. It was 1 in the morning when I nicked my thumb on a piece of plexi, the small, bright kind of cut that surprises you with how much it stings. Before I could find a bandage, he was there with the small blue first aid kit he kept in his backpack, the one he joked made him an Eagle Scout of architecture. He cleaned the cut, his hand steady, and I resisted the urge to make a joke because the closeness was already won. "You don't have to," I started. I know, he said. I want to. He taped the bandage with the care of someone who believes small things deserve attention. His fingertips were warm where they brushed mine. He looked up at me with a question in his eyes I decided not to answer yet. He didn't push. He smiled a fraction. You're okay? Yeah, I said, and my voice came out quieter than I expected. I am. We walked home together, our steps matching without effort. The October air had turned from crisp to cold. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. He handed me his scarf when I shivered and made no ceremony of it. I took it and made no ceremony either. We climbed the stairs and didn't turn on the living room light. The city lit enough of our walls for us to see where we were going. It didn't happen all at once. It never does, no matter what the movies try to tell you. It happens in the grocery store when you learn that he chooses peaches the way he chooses ideas. Gentle pressure, patience, trust in what's not visible yet. It happens in the laundromat when you see him help an older man fold a stubborn sheet, the two of them laughing like neighbors. It happens at the kitchen table when you're both too tired to talk, and yet he says, "Give me your top 3 buildings of all time and tell me why." And you do, and you watch his eyes light up at your reasons. It happens when you're washing dishes, and he puts a dish towel over his shoulder like an old diner server, and your heart does something your head can't name. We had our first real fight 2 weeks in. It was a small thing, which is how the real fights usually start. The studio had announced a competition that everyone, including us, wanted to enter. The brief asked for a community center near the river, a place that could hold language classes and basketball games and a kitchen that looked out on a garden. We both read it like it was written to test every choice we'd ever wanted to make. He came home with a stack of trace and a fevered look. I came home with a plan so detailed it scared me a little. I think the key is the courtyard, I said, laying out my drawings like I was dealing cards. Not a rectangle, something softer. The classroom's open to it. The gym becomes a backdrop, not a boss. I think the key is section, he said, overlaying his own lines at a diagonal to mine. Let the roof lift where the light wants to enter. Make the circulation visible. People should feel like the building is teaching them how to move. I admired his clarity the way I admired a strong wind. You can't help but be affected even as you brace. He admired my intuition the way he admires a river. Beautiful, yes, but look where it's going. We circled, we nodded, we spoke in verbs. Then it turned. He put down his pencil and said something about my plans being too dreamy, and I said something about his sections being too dry, and we each said too like we were cross-examining the other. We raised our voices, but not too loud. The apartment didn't deserve to be a battlefield. He said, you always do this. And the always was what did it. That word is never fair. It never is. I said, you think moving a line is moving a person. And I saw the sentence land and I wanted to pull it back, but there it was. Silence followed us around the table like a polite ghost. He looked down at his hands, those precise, careful hands, and chewed his bottom lip until it gave up. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean always. I meant I'm scared. That's all? I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath for a year. I'm scared too, I said. Isn't that funny? He went to the stove and put a pot on. I sat and watched the water gather itself. He made us tea the way he did everything. Water hot, tea steeped long enough to matter, lemon squeezed like punctuation. He set the mug in front of me and leaned on the counter, a habit that was becoming a comfort. I learned to be precise because imprecision wasn't safe where I grew up, he said. You fixed what you could fix. You lined up what you could line up. We were far from any lamp-lit confessional, and yet the kitchen made room for it. It always does. I could see him at 10, a boy with a ruler and a difficult morning, making his bed tight enough to hold a day that threatened to fall apart. I could see myself at the same age, drawing buildings with windows large enough to let in breath. My father standing behind me with a frown because he thought art was frivolous and I had to prove otherwise. My dad wanted me to build something he could stand inside and point to, I said, staring at the steam rising. I'm trying to build spaces where people feel like themselves. Only I don't say that in crit because they'll call it sentimental. And I don't say it to my dad because he'll call it something else. What would he call it? Mason asked softly. A phase, I said, and we both knew I didn't mean architecture anymore. The tea cooled. The world outside went about its business. We stood there and let the truth stretch its limbs. He didn't rush in with answers or try to turn the moment into a plan. He nodded once, slow. "Okay," he said. "Okay." After that, the edges softened. We still argued about forms and functions, about budget realities and hopeful gestures, about doors that wanted to be windows and windows that wanted to be roofs. But we learned the way around the words that stung. We put sticky notes on the fridge with grocery items and also with the smallest encouragements. "Your section sings," I wrote on a Tuesday. "Your courtyard breathes," he wrote on a Thursday. It was possible to live like that. There's this thing that happens when a storm arrives unannounced. You hear it before you feel it, the barely there tremor of something coming, the change in the quality of light. We were walking home from studio one evening when the sky turned that color it only turns when it's about to let go. He looked up and said, "We're not going to make it." "We might," I said, "because hope is a muscle you can choose to flex." The first fat drops hit our faces like a joke. We laughed and ran, but it was no use. By the time we turned onto our street, the rain had committed. Mason pulled a compact umbrella from his bag and popped it open. We huddled under it, shoulders pressed, breaths a little ragged from the sprint. The umbrella kept our hair dry, but not our sleeves. The water ran down my back and made the fabric cling. He stood close enough that I could hear the way his breath steadied against my ear. "This is ridiculous," I said. And somehow my voice sounded fond. "Beautiful ridiculous," he said. And the words felt like a prediction. At the door, we stood for a second because to move meant losing the small cave we'd made. The stairwell smelled like wet wood and old conversations. He reached for the key and his hand brushed mine. We both went still. It could have been a romantic comedy beat, the kind where music rises. Instead, it was a real moment, messy and kind, full of things we were not ready to say. "After you," he said. Voice steady. "Thank you," I said, the words polite and insufficient. Upstairs, we towed off our wet shoes and left them by the mat. He went to change and came back in dry clothes and thick socks. I did the same. We met again in the kitchen because we always did. He set an old vinyl on the turntable he'd brought, something with a gentle piano, and let it play low. The sound filled the corners. I made us grilled cheese because there are times when you surrender to comfort and let cheese and bread be what they are. We ate standing up the way you do when you're too damp and too full of feeling to manage a chair. He took half a step closer. I could see the rain still caught in his hair. He might have said my name or I might have imagined it. Either way, I knew then that what terrified me wasn't that he was my rival. It was that he wasn't. Not anymore. Not in the way that mattered. He was becoming the person I measured my day against. He was becoming the home I hadn't thought to draw. There are 100 ways a kiss can happen. Ours didn't happen that night. It waited, gathering itself like a storm and like a sunrise. It waited until a night when waiting would have been a lie. The day it arrived started ordinary and got complicated. We had midterm reviews, the kind where you pin everything up and try to pretend it's not your heart stapled to the wall. I watched him present with that steady voice. The one that says I've thought about this and I'll think about it again. And for the first time in a long time, I felt proud of him without having to swallow anything bitter. When it was my turn, I did the thing I do. I asked the building questions. Where do you like to gather? What does your morning feel like? Who is your favorite visitor? I heard myself risk saying love once when I meant light, and nobody laughed. Professor Chen tilted her head and smiled. At the end, someone said, "Thank you for showing us the people who might live here." And I felt relief spread through me like warmth after cold. We walked home through air that had remembered what fall is for. He bought us root beers from the deli. We clinked the bottles like we were 21 and not carrying deadlines. Back at the apartment, he took my drawings out of the tube and laid them on the table. He looked at them like he had the first day we moved in, but softer. "You look like yourself on paper," he said. "That's rare." "You've been looking," I said. And I knew it was an acknowledgement of everything, not just the drawings. He selected a record with a trumpet that sounded like a man telling a story he'd waited too long to tell. We didn't dance. We swayed, maybe, in that involuntary way your body moves when music makes a suggestion. The kitchen light above us hummed. The plant by the window had learned our breath by then. He moved closer, and this time I didn't step back. He touched my wrist, not my hand, and I felt it in my chest. I looked at him and saw every sharp edge I had misunderstood as a wall. I saw the boy who had learned to line things up to make the day behave. I saw the man who made tea when he didn't know what else to offer. I saw the rival who had turned into a mirror and then into a door. "Julian," he said, my name a carefully opened door. "Can I?" "Yes," I said, and the word was a release. When it finally happened, when we crossed that small and enormous space, it wasn't fireworks. It wasn't a chorus of angels. It was somehow both quieter and louder than those. Our first kiss felt like stepping into a room I'd already built in my mind. Like putting a hand on a railing you know will hold. It was tentative and sure, a contradiction that made perfect sense. He tasted like root beer, and something I had been trying not to name. We broke apart and looked at each other because the first silence afterward matters as much as the kiss. It's the place where you decide if you're going to pretend it meant nothing or everything or the thing in between. The music kept telling its story. The apartment held its breath and then breathed again. "Okay," he said, and in his voice there was amazement and relief and a kind of practical joy. "Okay," I said, and I laughed because sometimes joy needs somewhere to go. He leaned his forehead against mine. The gesture so natural it felt like we had done it 100 times. We hadn't. That was the miracle. He stepped back just enough that we could see each other plainly. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." He meant the dishes and the deadlines and the way we would walk into studio tomorrow and be us for the world and us for us. He meant that the rivalry had become something kinder, something with a spine. He meant that we were as careful and as reckless as we'd ever be at the same time. He meant I was not alone in this. We ate the ice cream we had in the freezer because it seemed important to tether magic to something as ordinary as dessert. We talked about nothing that could hurt us. He told me about the weird noise the radiator made that morning. I told him about the dream I had about a house with stairs that went nowhere, which we both agreed was not that strange given our profession. We brushed our teeth in the same bathroom and took turns spitting into the same sink and splashed our faces like boys at camp. When I went to my room, I closed the door gently and leaned my back against it and smiled at the ceiling like it held a secret. The floor creaked slightly as he moved on the other side of the wall. I pressed my palm fondly against the paint, absurdly, like I might feel his heartbeat through the plaster. I didn't, of course. But I slept well. And in the morning, the light that came through the blinds looked like the first page of a new chapter.